When you think of historical plagues, your mind probably goes straight to the Black Death, bubonic boils, rats in the streets, a third of Europe wiped out. We've all been taught that story. But what if I told you about a plague that was, in some ways, even more terrifying? A disease that didn't attack the body with sickness, but hijacked it. A contagion that didn't make you cough or bleed, but forced you to dance until your heart exploded. This is the story of the dancing plague of 1518, a historical nightmare that's been brushed aside as a bizarre footnote. But the reality of what happened in the streets of Strasbourg, France, is a psychological horror story so strange, it makes the Black Death look straightforward. You're about to discover how a city of hundreds was forced into a death march set to music, and why the real cause is more chilling than any medieval curse. It all started in July 1518, on a hot, dusty street in Strasbourg. A lone woman, known to history as Frau Trophäa, walked out of her home, stepped into the middle of the road, and began to dance. There was no music, no celebration, just this one woman, silently, fervently, dancing. Her neighbors watched, confused. Her husband begged her to stop, but she couldn't. Her body was a prisoner to a rhythm only she could feel. She didn't eat. She didn't sleep. She just danced. For 6 straight days, her body jerked and twirled on the cobblestone until she finally collapsed from sheer exhaustion. But this wasn't the end. It was the beginning. Within a week, something terrifying began to happen. 34 other people had joined her in the streets, their bodies now also locked in the same involuntary, silent dance. The plague was spreading. Imagine the scene. This wasn't a party. It was a silent, agonizing marathon. Within a month, the number of dancers had swelled to over 400. The city's main square was now a writhing mass of humanity, a real-life horror show. Historical accounts describe people with torn clothing and bleeding feet, their faces slick with sweat, eyes wide with a terror that their bodies completely ignored. They were screaming in pain, begging for help, all while their legs and arms continued to flail and stomp uncontrollably. They weren't dancing with joy. They were being danced to death by an invisible puppet master. This was a psychological virus, spreading through sight and suggestion. Seeing your neighbor, your friend, consumed by this mania was enough to trigger it in yourself. The city was in the grip of a waking nightmare, and the authorities had to do something. Their solution would turn a crisis into a catastrophe. The city's leaders and physicians were stumped. They didn't see a curse or a mental affliction. Based on their primitive understanding of medicine, they concluded the dancers were suffering from hot blood and that the only cure was to sweat the fever out. Their prescription? More dancing. This is where the story turns from bizarre to deadly. The authorities made a fatal decision. They cleared out the city's guild halls, erected a massive wooden stage in the market square, and even hired professional musicians to provide a soundtrack for the plague. They believed that if they encouraged the dancing, the victims would tire themselves out and be cured. It was the medieval equivalent of trying to put out a fire with gasoline. The constant music and the official stage only encouraged more people to join the fray. They turned an epidemic into a public spectacle, a dance-a-thon from hell where the only prize was a gruesome death. You can't dance for weeks on end. The human body is not built for it, and soon, the dying began. People started dropping dead in the middle of their manic movements. The causes of death were brutal and swift. Heart attacks, strokes, ruptured blood vessels, and pure, agonizing exhaustion. Historical records from the city of Strasbourg state that at the plague's peak it was killing up to 15 people per day. Imagine the horror. Servants would have to wade into the writhing crowd to drag out the corpses of those who had collapsed, while the people dancing next to them couldn't stop, their bodies forcing them to stomp around the freshly dead. The musicians, hired to help, played on, their music becoming a funeral dirge for a city that had lost its mind. This wasn't a plague of germs, it was a plague of motion, and the only end was total collapse. So what in God's name was going on? For centuries, this was blamed on a curse or divine punishment. But modern science offers a few chilling possibilities that are far more real. The first theory: Mass poisoning. A fungus called ergot, which grows on damp rye stalks. The grain used to make bread can cause severe muscle spasms, convulsions, and intense hallucinations. This condition, called St. Anthony's fire, could have made people's bodies twitch uncontrollably. But the most widely accepted theory is even scarier because the monster was inside their own minds. It's called mass psychogenic illness, or mass hysteria. The people of 1518 lived in a world of unimaginable stress. They were on the brink of starvation after years of famine and riddled with diseases like syphilis and smallpox. They were deeply superstitious, believing their souls were in constant peril. Historians believe the city of Strasbourg was a psychological powder keg waiting for a spark. Frau Trophea was that spark. In this state of extreme, prolonged anxiety, the human mind can snap, triggering a bizarre physical reaction that spreads like a social contagion. Their bodies were simply acting out the intense, inescapable terror that their minds could no longer handle. They didn't dance because they were cursed. They danced because they had been pushed beyond the limits of human sanity. So there you have it. The dancing plague wasn't a myth. It was a documented medical phenomenon where hundreds of people were killed by their own bodies, egged on by authorities who tragically misunderstood. It's a terrifying reminder that the most dangerous plagues aren't always the ones you can see under a microscope. Sometimes the most dangerous plague is fear itself. If you want to uncover more forgotten horrors that history tried to hide, make sure you hit that subscribe button, because the truth is always stranger, far more terrifying than the stories we're told.